Oke, selamat siang semua. Good afternoon. Selamat datang di Indonesia Study Group. My name is Sarah from Indonesia Project, and I'll chair today's event. So before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And we're very happy to have Professor Chandra here today to present. So Professor Chandra is a professor and the director of the Asian Studies Center, shown here at Michigan State University. He has done a lot of studies on Indonesia. He's a fluent Bahasa speaker. So we're so happy to have him here all the way from US. And today he'll present his work on demographic anomalies. During the years of living dangerously. I think he'll review what that means. Apparently, it's from a wide body of work that Professor Chandra has been doing. So he'll talk about an hour, and then we'll have 30 minutes of Q&A afterwards. And please limit your questions to clarification only during his talk. And this is a hybrid event, and we'll be taking questions from those in the room and online. The online ones questions, you can write it in the Q&A box on Zoom, and then one of our staff will read it out. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Chandra.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Sarah. And I'd like to start by, of course, thanking everybody for coming, taking time out on this beautiful sunny day to attend this talk. Also to those online, I hope there are at least a few people. I also wanted to thank the staff and faculty in the Indonesian Studies Group for your incredible warmth and generosity. Budi for first suggesting, Pak Budi Reso Sudarmo for first suggesting that I give a talk while I was here. And then Catherine, Chacha, I don't know if Dika is here. Thank you. Also Sarah for agreeing to be part of this this presentation. I'd like to start with a thank you, because this presentation is not about a single paper or a single finding. It's about a body of work, and that body of work has been really intensively collaborative. There are a lot of people who have advised me, inspired me, worked with me, co-authored articles with me. So the next page is going to look a little bit crowded, and I apologize to those whose names aren't here, because I'm sure I may have omitted a few. But I wanted to acknowledge, first of all, Eric Thorbecke, who was my dissertation advisor, who passed away a couple of months ago. Three of, I think, many senior colleagues who've talked to me and inspired me in this project. Robert Cribb, who I believe is in Melbourne today. Bob Hefner, anthropologist of Indonesia, some of you may know, in the US, and Saskia Wieringa, who's worked in the human rights area in the Netherlands. And then a number of, there's a long list there. I think Matthias is in the room, Matthias Hammer, Vanessa Heerman, Douglas Cameron, Haley Kurak, a student, Camille North, who's designed some of the work that we've done, the graphic design, Vincent Ogueno, Annie Pullman, Jeff Robinson, John Rusa, Ashton Shortridge, who's a geographer, Ingura Suryawan, Chris Vertan, Andrew Weintraub, Mark Winward, and Tang Zhang. I also want to acknowledge a number of organizations that have supported this work materially with funding or with facilities and resources, and they are listed. And all of that said, this work, if you want to point fingers at anybody, please point them at me. I'm going to take full responsibility for what is in this presentation. So I'm guessing most of you know this, but I always put a slide or two on just to introduce what this is about. The 1960s are an incredibly significant decade in Indonesian history. They're a watershed period. That's when the power transition between Sukarno and Suharto happens. The old order changes to the new order. It's precipitated by the assassination of 6 generals and other military officers. It's blamed on the Communist Party of Indonesia. What follows is a political purge of members of the PKI and people who are accused of being members, and many others. And we have the estimate that seems to be doing the rounds of how many people were killed as a result of this violence is 500,000. And I think that's a number that Robert Cribb first suggested. And everybody said, for lack of a better estimate, let's go with it. I'm going to address that question as part of the presentation. Situation in 2025, 2026, we're at the 60th, now coming up on the 61st anniversary. There's talk about a 10-volume history of Indonesia, going to be published for students in Indonesia. And it's raised some interesting questions about the place of the 1960s in general and the events of 1965 and their aftermath in particular in the curriculum in Indonesia. So I think this has a lot of significance in terms of the history of Indonesia and how Indonesians, the hundreds of millions of Indonesians, are going to be educated and receive this history. This, of course, the events and the 1960s, again, more generally, have received a lot of attention across the disciplines. These are a few examples of books, some from slightly earlier generations, some from newer generations of scholars, many from the Australian National University, I think perhaps the best represented university in terms of research on the subject. So just listed it: history, anthropology, political science, memory studies, and a number of additional disciplines for which there's no room on the slide. Okay, so what are some of the gaps in research on the 1960s and 1965 in particular? One of the really wonderful things that happened when the new order came into being is there was an efflorescence of demographic research on Indonesia. And prior to the creation of this demographic infrastructure, not a lot of data, certainly not a lot of high quality data had been collected on Indonesian demography. And these data were collected, I think, primarily with the goal of looking forward into the 1970s and beyond to try to address what was then perceived as the population problem in Indonesia. There were too many babies being born, there were too many mouths to feed, there was an economic crisis going on, and how do we resolve this with demographic intervention? And family planning came into being as a result of those efforts, and a lot of wonderful data as well, right? So what I want to emphasize on this slide is while there's little to no demographic research on the 60s, most of it was on the 70s and beyond, there's some incredibly valuable census data that can be used to look at what happened in the 1960s. Okay, so why are censuses important? I think for the demographers in the room, you already know. But one of the very important things is that censuses are government publications. And so they are state sanctioned. If they're done well, they give you nationwide coverage. They're not patchy in their coverage. They provide detailed information. They provide information about every individual in the country, sometimes a sample, but one that's representative. And mass violence of the kind and upheaval of the kind that we see in the mid to late 1960s is likely to leave a signature in census data if you know where to look for it. That's really the premise of this entire project. So the broad project goals here are a conversation with the vast and rich existing literature on the mass killings of 65. You saw 6 book covers. They're a small fraction of everything that's been written on the subject. There's been limited literature on the demography of the 60s. That's where we are hoping as part of this project to contribute. And we take a multidisciplinary approach. So the question here is not how do we develop better demographic methods to do the analysis. It doesn't come from a discipline. It's what happened in 1965 and how can we understand it through the lens of the census. Okay, so what are the specific goals? To use new order data. You have censuses in 1971 and 1980 to understand the 1960s. They're complemented by the 1961 census as well, and occasionally by some other data that were also being made available in the 60s and 70s. And the specific goals are to analyze census data to examine demographic anomalies in the 1960s, to estimate the comparative severity of demographic disruption in different locations, and to hold a conversation with the existing work on 1965. Okay, so let's start with question number 1. This is something that Robert Cribb addressed in his 1990 book, which I think most people will agree is now a classic in the field of 1965 studies. It was the first compilation of studies on what happened. And it was done, I think, very bravely at the height of the New Order. It was published in 1990, and I think that's something to really admire in that work. One of the things that Robert Cribb does is he tries to look at estimates of the magnitude of the killings. He provides, as of 1990, he provided as comprehensive a table of estimates as he could come up with. And if you look at the table, the range is so wide as to be, almost meaningless, 78,000 to 2 million. If you're interested in numbers, that's a really wide range, right? Keep in mind that Sarwo Edi Wibowo, who was a senior Indonesian military officer at the time and led the RPKAD, the special forces, in some of the campaigns against the PKI, the Communist Party of Indonesia and Central Java and Bali, he actually in conversation, he's quoted as having said about 3 million people were killed, okay? And that's outside the range of anything on this table. But these are the kinds of numbers that were being bandied about. And one of the things that we did as part of this project is we said, can we look at demographic data and get some idea about the scale of these killings? So one of the things to point out, if you look at Cribb's table, this is mostly historians, journalists, political scientists, social scientists, but no demographers, okay? So demographers are notably, and demographic research is notably absent from the list. There do exist estimates of population growth rates in the 1960s. Those are usually very aggregated. At best, they're at the provincial level, and they almost invariably, they're exponential growth averages that don't really think about any kind of break that might have occurred in the middle, okay? And they were being produced in a particular context. The context was actually to think about the future and how to lower that average population growth rate through family planning programs, okay? There is, however, one exception. And the exception, and some of the demographers in the room may have known him, is Peter Way. So Peter Way was a demographer, is a demographer, I should say. He's now retired. He ended up heading the United States Bureau of the Census, the international branch of it, later on in his career. So he became a very senior demographer. And he produces a table of population estimates and population growth estimates. And what is unique, as far as I know, about this table is you have estimates of the population growth rate for each year, and they are different. Okay, so this is no longer an average population growth. That population in Indonesia grew at the rate of 2.1% between 1961 and 1971. This is, I'm going to look at fertility, mortality. I'm going to look at all the components from which I can do, cohort type analyses, and I'm going to calculate annual population growth rates. Okay, why is this important? This is important because, and Peter Way didn't do this, but if you put his population growth figures on a graph, you see something really interesting, right? And what you see is, because he has calculated individual annual population growth rates, there is a dip in the rate of population growth starting in 1965 and going through to the beginning of the following decade. Okay, so this is the first demographic anomaly that I want to present. And it actually allows you to think about how many people Indonesia lost during this turbulent period. Okay, and the way you do this is actually, it's really elementary. I mean, I think if you're a methodologist, you would call it trivial. In fact, a colleague of mine who is a methodologist has called it trivial. But what you can do is you can ask the question, we know that there was a crisis during this time period. If the crisis hadn't occurred and population had grown at a normal rate, what would the population have been at the end of this crisis period? And what is the deficit? Okay, and what was a little bit shocking to me when we did this calculation is the deficit. So and then if you want to do technical things, you can look at different ways to interpolate between the start and the finish of this period, and you can calculate different types of estimates. So we used a few standard methods of interpolation. We used linear, spline, step interpolation. But when you do the calculation, the cumulative population loss by the end of the crisis period is up in the range of 3 million. Okay, and this is different from any number in that table in Robert Cribb's book, but it looks a little bit like what Sarwo Edi was saying, what he was quoted as having said. So these are the estimates. It's a good 2+% of the population of Indonesia. So this is a big event. And these are some of the numbers. Okay. Now, what are the possible causes? Well, we know that there were a lot of killings happening, right? But the high-end estimate of 2 million in Robert Cribb's table falls short of this number by over 1 million. The accepted estimate, and Cribb is very straightforward in pulling that number up and saying 500,000, but it could be anything. If you look at his research, he's made it very clear that this is not on the basis of any rigorous demographic research. It just seems to be an emerging consensus. Okay, it's hard to weigh these figures in the ballpark. Okay. Now, what are other possible causes? Potentially fewer births. Okay, this is possible, but usually in times of crisis, declines in births tend to be a fraction of the kinds of phenomena that you see on the death side of the equation because of the age structure of the population. Also, if you look at work that was done on the 1960s, there's no evidence of lower fertility rates in the 1960s, in the mid-1960s. It could be famine. We know that this was a period of famine. I think Pierre van der Eng, you've talked about this a little bit when Arif Anindita was doing his presentation. There was sporadic famine to the extent that it was happening sporadically, but on a regular basis throughout the decade. It would be picked up in population growth rates. There are the occasional larger events. This is probably the largest one that we know of, the Lombok famine. But even there, the death toll was 50 to 60,000, which is a fraction of the deficit between what we're seeing, the 3 million and the 500,000 figure that we know of. Okay. So it's too low to explain such a large discrepancy. Could be net out migration, but the statistic for that is less than 100,000 during the time period. Could be natural disasters. Gunung Agung blew up in 1963 in Bali. There was a smaller eruption in Gunung Kelud in Jawa Timur, just north of Blitar. That was even smaller. But in terms of population loss, those were tiny. I mean, they were large at a sort of a human scale, but in relation to what we're seeing here, they were really just a fraction. Could be cohort effects. This is again something that Pierre van der Eng wrote a really interesting paper on. It could be an echo of the 1940 to 45 population bust that he identified. The problem with the population bust is to the extent that those people are in the childbearing years for a longer period of time, you would expect any dip in the population growth rate to persist over more than a period of just 4 or 5 years. So that's really not in my opinion, not a credible explanation. Okay, so conclusions. Indonesia's mid-1960s population deficit is 3 million plus actually. The large gap between this deficit and the accepted figures is not explained by other factors. And a revised figure of, I would say, just to be conservative, because maybe there's something else going on that we haven't seen. I would say if you want to be cautious, a revised figure of upwards of 2 million killed, or 4 times the accepted figure, is plausible given this. And I'm very happy to be contradicted if somebody in this room knows about something that happened that can explain this gap before the paper gets published. Okay, that's an infographic. I have a student, a former student at our university who produces them. And I'm going to actually show you a number of these infographics for papers we did, for which we don't have time to do a lengthy presentation. Okay, this is another very important phenomenon that not a lot of people have talked about, orphaning and adoption. Okay, if 500,000 people, to take the traditional estimate, were killed, and many of them, by the way, were young men, okay, young men who would have been parents at the time. Remember, we are living in an area where there's a very high fertility rate. They probably, by the time they were 25 years old, probably had a couple of children, maybe 3, right? For every one of them who's been killed, you have 2 to 3 orphans, right? And so one of the interesting questions is, can the censuses tell us anything about the phenomenon of orphaning, right? And so the way we approached this was actually motivated originally. Okay, so millions were killed, millions or more would have been orphaned. The census data should contain signatures of mass orphaning, right? And what should we be looking for? Potentially anomalies in family structure and birth patterns, right? So that's the next set of results I'm going to show you. These results come out of the 1980 census microdata. This is the first census for which I've been able to find birth months It turns out the month in which you were born becomes very significant, as you see. If anybody knows a way to get a hold of 1971 census data with birth month, I would be eternally grateful to you, because that's much closer in time to 1965. And so there'll be less sort of diffusion of the signature of the event in the 1971 census. So the questions asked here are, what are the anomalies, if any, in birth patterns? And do we see anomalies in family structure, which we might expect to see if there's a lot of orphaning going on? Okay, so what might we expect? If there are anomalies in birth patterns, they should appear after the event, right? Why? Because generally, if something's going to affect births, it's got to happen 9 to 10 months in advance, which is the gestation period for a baby. Okay? And there's a very good example of that with the 1918 influenza pandemic. If you look at when the deaths during the pandemic peaked, in most parts of the world, Australia being a notable exception, by the way, the deaths peaked in October 1980, right? And what we see is about 9 to 10 months later, we see a cratering in the number of babies being born, right? And it's something that people who cross over between public health and demography have called a failure to conceive, which could be either behavioral or biological, which is a very interesting and big question unto itself, right? So the question that we asked, it was motivated by this. What happened in Indonesia in 1965 and 9 to 10 months later, right? Okay. I'll start by just showing you what we discovered. This is a paper that we published in the American Journal of Epidemiology. It's not about Indonesia, but it tells you about what happens during pandemics. These are 4 of the, I think, 10-ish states that we studied. And what you find is, after seasonally adjusting your birth and death data, the red line shows you deaths, seasonally adjusted. So this is excess deaths, right? This is the irregular component of the seasonally of the series. I can go into details later on. So you have a peak in deaths in October 1918, and 9 months later, you have a cratering in births. You have a huge deficit in births, and this corresponds to the gestation period for baby, right? So what we were looking for in the census data of 1980 for Indonesia was some evidence, because we knew when people were being reported as having been born by month and year. Is there something weird that happens 9 to 10 months after the killings in 1965 to the number of babies being born? Okay, all right. And what we found really surprised us. It was the most bizarre thing in the world. So this is the time series. This is the number of babies being born, and we picked East Java because if you know 1965, you know it was one of the worst affected provinces, right? So this is the number of babies being born by month over, and I'm just showing you about a 5-year period. We actually did it for the entire decade. And what you see is really interesting. So in 1965, there's a spike, okay, in the 1980 census. There's a spike in the number of people who are being reported as having been born in September 1965, right? And this is very different from the position of your normal, your garden variety September in 1963, 64, 66, and 67. It's much higher than it should be. And by the way, so is October. October and September should be much lower. They should be down here somewhere, but they're not. Okay. The other phenomenon you see, by the way, is age heaping. For those who do demography, it's there, and we do need to adjust for it when we do these analyses. Okay, so there's a strong seasonal pattern. You see the ups and downs of numbers of babies being born. This is a well-established phenomenon worldwide. Births in 1965 are, so in addition to the seasonal pattern, right, more babies born at a particular time of the year, 65 in general is higher. Why? Because of age heaping. And age heaping, for those who don't do demography, is when you do a census, people, if they don't remember their exact birth year, they'll often round off to the nearest 0 or 5, the nearest 10 or 5 years. And for a 1980 census, that means a lot of people are going to be saying, yeah, there's a kid in the house. He's actually 14 years old, but I don't remember. He's 15 years old. Okay, so these are the 15-year-olds. So it coincides with age heaping, and you have to take care of that problem. Okay, patterns in the raw data. There's a strong seasonal pattern. Births in 1965 are higher as a whole because of age heaping, and that rounding off to the nearest, in this case, 5th year. But births in September and October 65 are much higher than September and October in neighboring years. Okay, and this is a mystery. Why is it a mystery? Because if anything was going to happen to births, it should have happened 9 to 10 months after September, October, November, or December 1965, when the bulk of the killings were happening, right? And this is not what we observe. So this is where we flush out the seasonal and the trend components of the birth data. This is the irregular component, so you can actually calculate the number of excess people who are being reported as having been born in September 65 relative to what you would expect. Okay, so basically what this means is in the 1980 census, there are a lot of probably heads of households who are telling the census taker, I have a kid in the house who was born in September 1965 or October 1965. There are far more than there should be. Okay, that's what this boils down to. And the question is why and what is going on? Because we know that 10 months before that or 9 months before, nothing really of note happened that would have affected these kinds of patterns. If somebody does know of something of note, by the way, I'd be very interested in knowing that too. So the strange thing about this data set is anomalies are observed at the start of the upheavals, not 9 to 10 months later. Okay? There's a large spike in September, October 65. In the case of East Java, it's almost 18,000. There are 18,000 extra babies, 15-year-olds. Okay. So to explore this further, because we were truly mystified by it, we said, let's take a look at the geography. And the 1980 census does give you a Kabupaten variable, a daerah tingkat 2. If anybody knows of Kecamatan variables as well, we would love to have them. I haven't been able to find the data by Kecamatan, but that would make it much more interesting. Anyway, in percentage terms, Blitar city has the largest excess, right? It has more than 58% excess births being reported as of September 1965 than it should have. Okay. By the way, for those of you who know about what happens, the Blitar area, in particular South Blitar, Blitar Selatan, was a major PKI stronghold. It was in fact the location where Operasi Trisula was held in 1968 because a bunch of PKI senior officials had fled there, seeking refuge from the killings in other parts of Indonesia. Okay, let's take a look. So this is a map of the Kabupaten and the Kota Madya of Jawa Timur, showing excess births as a percentage of total births. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fade this into a map showing PKI seats, the percentage of seats won by the PKI in each of these locations. Okay. And what you'll see is, of course, this is not an exact science. It's not a perfect correlation, but the maps are quite similar to each other. And if you put this on a scatter plot, you get the picture, right? Of course, this is, as I said, this is not an exact science. These are Kabupaten, they are highly aggregated regions, but there is still a relationship between the percentage of total vote going to the PKI and excess births as a percentage of total. So what does this mean? This phenomenon of babies being born in 1965 seems to be much more pronounced in areas that were PKI strongholds. Okay, what does that mean? So trying to explain this anomaly, it happens not in the aftermath of 65, but at the start. It's not precipitated by an event 9 to 10 months prior, unless somebody knows of one. It's not likely to be a real birth spike. This is not real babies being born. Suddenly you have an extra 17,000 babies being born in this 2 months time, right? The alternative explanation, there's actually a third one, which I won't go into in this presentation, is misreporting. Maybe the head of the household is saying, I have a kid in the house, and that kid was born in September 1965. But because it's a statistical anomaly, it suggests that there's a whole bunch of them who are saying it when it's probably not true, right? Now, why might it not be true? One possibility is the head of the household, whoever's answering the census taker's question, doesn't know when a kid in the household was born, right? Another is maybe they're doing it deliberately. maybe for whatever reason, they want to hide the identity of the child. It could be something that this is a term I've coined, it's event heaping. There may be something analogous to age heaping, that rounding off phenomenon that has to do with an event. I had a kid who was born in the mid-1960s, and oh yeah, that was the time this event happened, therefore that's what I'm going to report, because I don't remember the exact date. Could be. In any case, if this is happening, the head of the household is unlikely to be the birth parent of the child if this is misreported. Okay? And so the next thing we look at, and we have this variable in the 1980 census, is the relationship of each individual in the household to the head of the household. Okay? And what we see here is, so these are children who were reported as having been born in September 64, September 65, and September 66 in the 1980 census. Okay? And what is interesting is there is a bump in the percentage of those children in 1965, right, who are living in a household that's headed by a relative other than their own parent. Okay? There's more kids in East Java who are part of this group of this cohort of kids which has this anomalous spike, right? Who are being reported as being living in a household with a relative, but who's not their mom or dad. Okay, whose head of household is not. Okay, what is all of this pointing to? Oh yeah. Oh, so then you can do a geographic analysis of this as well, right? And is this anomaly somehow related to how strong the PKI was in these different locations? And here again, what we see is that in Kabubatan and Kota Madhya, where the PKI had more support, the percentage of children living with a non-parent relative, right, is higher. Okay. That's the infographic that goes with it. By the way, the Indonesian government seemed to be aware of the problem of orphaning. Because in 1960, I think this was in the early 70s, they commissioned a report by IKIP Surabaya to actually look at the problem of taking care of the orphans of victims of 19. In this case, it's not 1965. These were orphans of people who were killed during Operasi Trisula in 1968. But if you think of 65 as being a sort of a much larger event, then the government was also aware of this problem and was trying to do something to take care of it. This is a research project that was commissioned. Okay, what are the conclusions from this? There are anomalous patterns of birth and family structure, very clearly. The birth spike varies systematically with PKI strength across East Java. The spike cohort is more likely to be living with a non-parent relative than other cohorts in their vicinity in the earlier year or the later year. Okay? And that likelihood also varies systematically with PKI strength across East Java. Right? Together, we interpret this as being consistent with mass orphaning and adoption. Okay? And keep in mind, the misreporting is probably happening to a fraction, for a fraction of the kids who are actually orphaned. Right? I think we are looking at the tip of an iceberg here. But it's a signature of 1965 in the census. Okay? And back to the final point, many of these orphans are alive today. They're roughly my age. Probably millions. Okay. The next few parts I'm going to go through really quickly. How are we doing for time?
Half an hour.
Rapa?
Half an hour.
Half an hour. Oh, wonderful. Okay. So the next thing we look at is we look at a little more spatial variation. And now I'm going to do it a little more quickly, just to show you a few of the other things that have emerged from the analysis of these censuses. For this analysis, we're going to use census data to calculate one-time breaks in population, drops in population, or gains associated with 1965. We're going to compare locations with abrupt changes in population with anecdotal accounts. Okay, so we're going to cross-validate. We're going to calculate how many people are missing in a location who should be there, given how population was growing. And then does this match with what we see in the huge literature that's already been produced. A lot of it is anecdotal, but it's still very reliable evidence and data, right? And then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to identify spatial patterns of population change in relation to these anecdotal accounts. So we're going to look across larger geographies. Okay, the basics of the approach, simultaneous. So one of the nice things the census lets you do, because the coverage is broad, you can do the simultaneous analysis of multiple regions, right? We're going to use very simple demographic statistical methods and census data. We're going to use 3 relevant censuses that are close to 1965 and 66 and 67 in time. And these are the 61 census that precedes the killings and the violence, 1971, immediately after it, and 1980. By the time you reach 1990 and beyond, the signature of these events begins to diffuse. So we're going to look at censuses that are close in time to what's happening. All right. This is I can't emphasize this enough. This is a very simplistic analysis. It's a starting point, but what we find is quite compelling. And so I think the results of what we're doing should be taken in that spirit. This is not about precision. If you want to know down to the last 10 people, what happened somewhere, this is really not the place to look. But when you start looking across space at what's happening, I think you'll see some quite compelling findings. Okay. So the steps that we use, and perhaps this is best shown on a graph, right? So we have 3 census observations for each location. And in most locations, the analysis is done at the level of the kecamatan. In a few locations where we were lucky enough to get village desa level data, we've done desa level analysis. Okay. The red dots here represent the time points for which we have an actual observation of the number of people in a location at that time, right? The 61 census, the 71 census, and the 1980 census. We assume that nothing major happened between 1971 and 1980 that would cause a break in the trajectory. You can use Microsoft Excel if you want to compute the population growth rate using an exponential model between these 2 points in time. Okay? Once you've got that growth rate, you can backward project it in time to around early 1966. You can do this using a time unit of a day, a month, a year, whatever you want, right? And this gives you the post-violence estimate of the population. Okay? You notice that this line is slightly steeper than this line. It needs to be adjusted downward a bit because this is the decade during which the family planning efforts began to really pay off. And so the population growth rate in most locations in these areas, Central East Java and Bali, and Daerah Istimewa Yogyakarta, is going to be lower in this decade than it is in the late 1960s, when things are just beginning to be put into place. Okay? You can use this 1960s growth rate to project population in 1961 forward in time to get a pre-upheaval estimate of the population. And the gap that you see is an estimate, albeit a crude one, of how bad things are in a location. Okay? Where you see a drop, there's probably a lot of violence, potentially out-migration, potentially even drops in the number of babies being born. These are the 3 aggregates that together determine population change, right? Births, deaths, and net migration. On occasion, you see jumps, which is a little bit surprising. But when you start seeing the patterns, you begin to realize that actually it's not very surprising. I'll show you why in just a moment. Okay, so interpreting the results, we pay the most attention to percentage changes rather than absolute numbers. They're just a little more reliable. Relative changes rather than individual changes. So we recognize that these things could be off. If there was an epidemic of cholera in a kecamatan that we didn't pick up, right, that's going to pollute the results. So we want to look at all of these estimates as a group and say, what's the general pattern without necessarily focusing on any one place, okay? And that's the importance of cross-validation, using what we already know from the vast literature to kind of, cross-validate what we're finding. And what we see is, yes, there's a lot of cross-validation that happens. It actually gels with what we know. But because the coverage of a census is much more systematic, right? You see many new patterns emerge. You see things happening in locations that the literature has not yet covered. And I think that's the really big contribution of this kind of analysis. Okay, so here are a few examples. Some of this is, by the way, published research. This was a paper that came out in the Journal of Asian Studies. We did this at the Kabupaten level. We did these population loss estimates. By the way, reds and pinks on all of the maps that you're going to see represent losses. The darker is the red, the greater is the loss. And the yellows and oranges and golden rods represent jumps in population. Okay. So if you look at the map of East Java by Kabupaten and Kota Madya, you see regions of population loss. We know that in the case of East Java, the army and Nahdlatul Ulama, which was the PKI's main competitor in the region, not the only one, but the main one, often worked hand in hand. And if you look at the percentage of the vote that Nahdlatul Ulama got in different Kabupaten in East Java in 1957, the local elections, you see a correlation between the percentage of votes cast for Nahdlatul Ulama and the calculation of population change. Okay. There are other factors too, by the way. I've done analyses with additional variables. There's a problem of communication that happens there. If you're writing for a political science audience, you want to do that kind of thing. If you're writing for an area studies audience, usually, I think the interest is much more on the main point here. This is the main point of the analysis. Okay, but we've controlled for things like terrain and a variety of other variables as well. Okay, Central Java, the picture is slightly different. There are multiple civilian organizations at work here. This is our estimate of population change. These are areas of strength for Nahdlatul Ulama. So you'll see, for example, the Demak area, which we know to be an area of strength, and along the northern coast. And you'll see there's some connection with the map of population loss, but it's not as strong as what you see in East Java. This is PNE. And here again, there are areas of overlap. And then there's a third area in Central Java, where you see a lot of population loss, where neither Nahdlatul Ulama, well, PNE is kind of strong, but this is the area where Sarwo Hedi Wibowo sets up the headquarters of the RPKAD when they're pursuing the leadership of the Communist Party of Indonesia and the Merah Pimel Bambu, right? So there's probably a lot of RPKAD activity going on here as well that contributes to this population. Okay. I should go back to East Java. Population gains, a lot of it seems to be happening along the southern coast. Remember Blitar Selatan, where a lot of people had fled, Communist Party people, where Operasi Trisula was then launched. That's down here on the southern coast. Okay. This is very advantageous if you're seeking refuge. The countryside here is limestone karst country. It's not well served by roads, so it's not easily accessible. Limestone gives you all kinds of great topography, cave systems, and so on, where you can hide. You actually see a lot of evidence of that in the reports of the Indonesian army when they're talking about what's happening in South Blitar. Okay. Logistics, another important one. Margot, you mentioned roads, right? So if you take a look at East Java, you look at the map of the main roads in East Java. This is the map of the main roads. And what we did here is we used GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to calculate the percentage of the area of each kecamatan that was within a kilometer of the road. And basically what this is a measure of the exposure of a kecamatan to the transportation network. Okay? If you read stories, again, from the rich literature on what's happening in Indonesia, you will see the truck mentioned probably in every second story, right? There's a lot of talk of trucks coming, people being loaded up onto trucks, taken away, and then whoever's telling you the story says, I never saw them again, okay? By the way, there are echoes of this, and this kind of echoes the Holocaust literature as well. The difference is the transportation infrastructure that's kind of iconic there is the railway system, the train system, right? Here it's roads. So these, the dark areas are kecamatan that are heavily exposed to the transportation infrastructure, right? And these two maps show you areas of population gain. Notice again how the southern coast of East Java is very well represented. So, by the way, are some of the volcanic complexes, which are remote, hard to get to, right? And the areas that show population losses have a much greater tendency, again, this is not an exact thing, to lie along roadways. Not exclusively again, but they show a higher tendency, right? And if you throw that up on a scatter plot, on the horizontal axis is the percentage of the Kecamatan's area that is within a kilometer of a road. And this is the estimate of population increase or decline, right? So what this is showing is there's a tendency for Kecamatan that are more exposed to the road network to see declines in population rather than increases. Migration is another big one. You saw a smaller version of this map on the earlier infographic, right? These are the areas of population gain in East Java, according to the calculations. And what's really interesting here is if you look at the report of the Brawijaya Kodam, the military command of East Java, on what they did during Operation Trisula, right? Which was the operation that they used to go into South Blitar and clean up, if you will, the remainder of the leadership of the BPI. They actually have a map there that talks about their intelligence of the region. And what they have found is in East Java, there were 7 areas where the Communist Party leadership had fled and were creating these compros, these committee projects. Actually, the committee projects were, I think, already around, but these were areas where they were gathering potentially to resist the Indonesian army in the aftermath of the early wave of killings in 1965, right? Those are circled on the map. And what you'll see is the circles correspond to areas. Kendeng we can't say because it's actually off in central Java, but the other areas correspond to, they have Kecamatan in them that show jumps in population. They correspond to areas of population gains. So this finding is actually consistent with people going to these areas, either because they want to regroup or because they think they're safe havens or both in the aftermath of the early killings in 1965. By the way, if you put these circles up on a map against the support for the Indonesian Communist Party in the 1957 election, again, you'll see there's kind of an association. It's obviously not statistical. We've just got 6 circles, but you kind of see a pattern, right? Okay. So there was a lot of migration going on, and this was one of the surprising findings, because if you look at the literature, it doesn't talk about mass migration. There are individuals who are running around in a lot of stories. You can look at literature, the story Bao by Omar Khayyam. There are individual testimonies about people running around, but it's never mass migration. This is, I think, evidence that there was mass migration. Okay. Proximity, I'm gonna really zip through this. I'll just show you one and then we'll move on. So these pentagons are the Kodim headquarters, right? And to the extent that the Indonesian army played a role in what was happening, you might expect that Kecamatan that are located farther away from the Kodim will tend to be a little bit safer, right? And that's essentially what you see here. If the distance, the distance of the centroid of a Kecamatan is closer to a Kodim headquarter, you're more likely to have a negative population outcome. If you're farther away, the outcome begins to look, on average, more and more positive. Okay. This is a little more complicated. This is the result of geographically weighted regression. What it's saying is this relationship is more pronounced in areas that are contained in these colored Kecamatan. So the relationship between distance and from a Kodim headquarter and population loss is much more salient here and here and here. I can explain this more at the end of the presentation if you want. But if you do spatial analysis, this is the result of a geographically weighted regression, which basically says we're going to look at this relationship, but we're going to look at it using every Kecamatan as the center of a limited area. We're going to do the estimate, then we're going to go to the next one and do the estimate, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And which ones show the relationship? That's really what GWR does here. Okay, I'm going to run through all of these. Volcanoes. This is another very important and interesting question. So when you do that population break analysis for Bali, you run into a problem, right? And the problem is, yes, there was a lot of violence and upheaval in 1965 and after, but there was also a huge volcanic explosion in 1963 with a little bit happening up into 1964, right? And the question is, how do we separate the effects of these two big demographic events? Okay? A little bit of background: when Gunung Agung blows up in 1963, the death toll is relatively low. It's about 2,000. It's still a huge number, but relative to what happens in 65, it's small. What happens in Bali mostly in 1963 is migration. People flee the area, the land is no longer tillable. A lot of them move to the western side of Java. Of Bali. So this was our computation of overall population loss in the mid-60s. Think of it as a combination of the eruption of Agung and 1965. And the question is, how do you separate the two out, right? Well, one way is to say, okay, the volcanic effect is probably related systematically to how far away you are from the volcanic crater, right? So what we can do is we can take this information on population change, and we can ask what component of that population change is systematically related to distance from the volcano. And we can estimate that. And once we estimate that, we can subtract that effect from this combined effect, and what you're left with is a residual that is not explained by the volcano. That's really the strategy here. Okay? So this is the combined effect. This is the volcano effect, and you'll see it's a very regular thing because it's a function of distance from the volcanic crater. We subtract this from this, and what you get is the residual. And we interpret this residual as being 1965. Okay? And again, you can cross-validate. For those of you who know about Bali, if you look at Jembrana, for example, right? Nagara is heavily affected, unlike its neighbors, right? If you look at southern Bali, we know Kasiman in the vicinity of Denpasar is heavily affected. There's anecdotes. There's an anecdote about a hotel on a beach that was being built, and there were mass graves, in the sand and so on. There's a lot of stories that I went back to side. Some of it's happening in Karangasem, and of course in Buleleng, it was bad, especially in the vicinity of Singaraja. Yeah. So that's the Bali analysis. This is a little more involved than some of the earlier work because we had to separate out the effect of a volcano from what's happening in 65. More on volcanoes, since we're doing volcanoes. This is back to East Java, but we used a different color scheme to emphasize what's happening around volcanic craters. Okay? So I think this is Gunung Lawu. This is Liman Willis. This is, of course, Raung Argopuro. This is Kalud. I think this is Arjuno, I forget. Okay? But what you'll see with Kacamatan around volcanoes, they kind of look like slices of a pie. That's kind of a marker of a volcano because all the Kacamatan, they go up to the peak and they taper off over there because there's a lot of Kacamatan coming up, right? The important point here is around most of these volcanoes, you see jumps in population. Blue means the population goes up, and dark blue means it really goes up. Okay? Why is this happening? It's probably people seeking refuge in remote areas, right? So we see this in 5 volcanoes in East Java. But very interestingly, and this is work Matthias and I are doing together, very interestingly, we see something totally the opposite in Merapi Merbabu, right? And in Merapi Merbabu, you actually see a massive decline in population in the Kacamatan that are close to the peaks of the mountains. This is the opposite of what we see in those East Javanese volcanoes, right? And it raises the question of why. And the answer, I think, is fairly straightforward if you know the history of the area. Merapi Merbabu is where Aidit, the leader of the Communist Party of Indonesia, was rumored to have fled initially. Of course, he was ultimately captured in Solo, next door, but he was rumored to be roaming around here. And then so were a lot of the other remnants of the Communist Party of Indonesia. This is also in the area of Klaten and Boyolali, which were known to be areas that were very sympathetic to the PKI. And so you might expect that people would flee there. And this was really the reason why Sarwo Edi, when he's deployed to Central Java, sets up the headquarters of the RPKAD, the Special Forces, in Kartasuro, which is the western suburb of Surakarta, right? And very well located in terms of road networks to get access to this area. Okay. So what follows is a series of campaigns where the RPKAD works with some of the battalions of the East Java Kodam, Brawijaya. They get up the mountain. This is a map from one of the newspapers from Berita Yudha, for those of you who are familiar, one of the military-oriented newspapers in Indonesia, where they actually talk about one of the campaigns. This is how the different battalions moved. This is Merapi, this is Merbabu, this is Merapi, this is Merbabu. Okay. So this volcano complex looks very different from East Java because it was specifically targeted by the special forces and the army in a way that those other volcanoes were. There's a lot more to this story. You can, sorry? 5 minutes, okay. The other thing you can see is if you take all of these kecamatan and you kind of wrap them around and put them on a scatter plot, right? You'll see that the closer you are to the crater of the volcano, right, the more negative your population outcome is going to be. And then as the distance between you and the crater increases, presumably you're not the focus of the military campaigns, right? You actually have positive outcomes. That you see in this ring of goldenrod and yellow around the crater of red. That's what's happening in Merapi. Okay. All right. Let's move on. And so you can actually compare these volcanoes, right? So this is Liman Willis, which is 2 volcanoes away from Merapi Merbabu. This one's red in the middle with an orange ring outside. This one's got everybody running up the slopes of the mountain and staying, not being removed. And I showed you that cross section. This is Merapi Merbabu. Farther you go away, more is the population jump. This is Liman Willis. The closer you get to the crater, greater is the population jump. This is a radius of 25 kilometers. The pattern seems to begin to diffuse after 25 kilometers for whatever reason. Okay, sex ratio is another very important thing. If you take a look at some of the iconic photographs of 1965, right? You're looking at people who are being rounded up. What do you see in these photographs? Who are these people demographically? They're male and they're youngish, right? Young males. So one of the things you can look at in the censuses is if the vast majority of people who are being arrested, killed, disappeared, whatever it is, are young males, right? Then instead of looking at the entire population where the patterns might get diffused, if you focus on that demographic, you're much more likely to see the signal. It's going to be stronger, right? So that's another thing we are studying. This is one example from very aggregate data. This is the sex ratio in East Java in the 1971 census. And there's a huge dip. This is males, number of males for every percentage of males as a percentage of females, right? Number of males for every female. Okay, there's a huge dip here. This is a very common phenomenon, by the way, in censuses. Young males, for whatever reason, don't tend to be as well represented as they should be in censuses. Perhaps they're mobile, they're going off somewhere else to study, won't bother to respond, whatever it is, right? So this dip you would expect to see in any census. But what's very interesting is 10 years later, about in the 1980 census, right, some of that dip moves 10 years to the right. Okay, and I'm just showing you East Java here. You see the same thing in Central Java. You see the same thing in Bali. Yeah, and so you're seeing this dip in the sex ratio move to the right, move by about 10 years, 10 years later, right, which suggests that there is a deficit of males in this cohort, right? This is a deficit because remember in the 1971 census, there isn't a deficit in that age category. Right? So these people are presumably a little more responsible in terms of showing up for the census. Well, there's still a deficit a decade. Let's move to the right. So this is another interesting phenomenon. You look at marital status of women. The percentage of young women ages 16 to 30, we kind of narrowed things down, who report themselves as being married, right, tends to be much lower in the areas in the Kabupatan where there's a negative population change. Okay, so more young women saying, I'm not married if they're living in an area that was a PKI stronghold. Sorry, in an area where the population showed a greater decline. Okay. This is suggestive of widowing, potentially claiming I'm divorced, when maybe I was widowed, but maybe I was divorced. I don't know. Maybe my husband went to jail, was in prison somewhere. Again, we don't have a lot of detail yet, but this is the direction in which we're going. So in conclusion, am I out of time? Well, so this is the last slide. The analysis of demographic anomalies can be quite revealing. It provides a spatially systematic portrait of what happened. I think it's very, very important to note that these censuses are state-sanctioned data. This is new order and for 1961 old order data. This is government data. The patterns are replicable. If you have the same census data that I did and you do the same calculations, you're going to find the same pictures, right? It also enables a conversation with the vast and rich literature that's already been produced. It helps to corroborate prior work. It also helps to build on it by filling out some gaps. It actually fills, I would argue, a multitude of conceptual and spatial gaps. So I'll stop there.
We'll have the floor for questions. So anyone from so Greg first, and then the gentleman back.
Thank you, Siddharth, for such a fascinating presentation and seeing what we can do. I get an entirely different perspective by looking at this demographically. So I was going to ask more about orphanage and the link. So the new order had this data and they were aware of this problem of orphanage and the likelihood that many of the numbers in this enlarged category were going to be the offspring of communists. And throughout the new order, they had that whole clean environment, the sort of thing where they're seeking to identify and put black marks against anyone from a communist family. Would there not have been regime research into this to know exactly who these orphans were, whether these people were potentially, as they saw it, a threat to the state? So that's the first question. I had a second question, which is a bit more gruesome, and that is, if the likely death toll is 6 times larger than the consensus would suggest it is, so if it's 3 billion, not 500,000, that's an enormous number of bodies to dispose of. So 500,000 is a lot, but we do have those accounts of the rivers having lots of dead bodies going down them, some mass burial sites. But if we're talking 3 billion, we're talking about enormous burial sites. We're talking about major rivers clogged with bodies in this period of months where most intensive killing took place. Is that something that is pause for thought, that the figure could be as high as 3 million? Or are there, in actual fact, were there hundreds of thousands of people who just either refused to witness this or refused to reveal what they had seen because there must have been killing on an industrial scale?
Yeah, these are great questions, Greg. Thank you. I want to start with your question about absolutely. So this report actually represents exactly the kind of research they're asking. Because what they're doing here is they're trying to assess families. So part of this was, let's learn about the kids themselves. And at this time, these kids are, by the way, this is work with Yosef Jaka Baba, who's in Jakarta. What they were trying to do is they were trying to find out, so these kids were all staying at the time with non-parent relatives in the area. And the question that they were asking in this report is, would it be feasible, desirable to move these kids over to other, presumably safer families, so that they could be raised with the intention that they not cause trouble in the future? This is literally in the introduction to the report. So what you're saying is this report completely aligns with what you're saying. It was a concern. And this is what the government was trying to do, is they were trying to figure out whether this was feasible. Now, I can tell you a little bit about what happens in the report. So the relatives who've adopted or are fostering these kids are very reluctant. The vast majority are reluctant to let go of them. I'm not going to let my adopted, my relative, my nephew, whoever it is, go off and live with some stranger, right? There were a few respondents to the survey. It's actually a fascinating survey to read. I highly recommend it. It's probably in the library here. If not here, it's in the NLA. So one of the things that we see is the few foster parents who say, yeah, okay, I'll let my kid go, is doing it because they think that the child will have a better future in terms of education, prosperity around them than they might with them, because they are living in the South Blitar area and it's a very poor, it's an impoverished area. I don't know if that answers your first question. Okay, the second question about numbers. I was honestly shocked and surprised to see this number, right? But my approach is, if you believe the work of a card-carrying demographer, clearly a very accomplished demographer, who had access to all the data, mentions all of those data in the report, right? And you then say, okay, if that's the case, I'm just going to draw this line on top, a normal population growth rate, and whatever pops out, right? Then that's the number you get. This is eminently replicable, right? The tables here, the raw data that I use in front of you. So then it raises the question, okay, if this is true, then can we corroborate it, right? My suspicion is there is a lot that was going on in 65 that we still don't know. The fact that the analysis of these census data can produce, this is mass migration, This is a lot of migration, and it's very systematic. People are going from up here, down here. Until we crunch these numbers, there was no mention of this in the literature, right? And these numbers are probably in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands, right? How did we miss this? So honestly, my response is, if you trust the process and you trust the data, and this is what you get, I think it raises the question that we need to answer this question. We need to find out, are we missing something, or is there something wrong with these calculations? I would tend to come down on the side that this is why I put a conservative estimate up there of 2 million, not 3 million, because it's so different from 500,000. We were shocked to see that. But, could it be 3 million? Well, Sarmo Eddy said it was, for what it's worth. Whether he was bragging or actually was saying what was going on, we don't know. So.
Thanks for a fascinating insight. As you rightly point out, this is all government data, and it's not just a matter of whether we trust it or not. It's whether the Indonesian people trusted the data, and actually, given such a traumatic event just happened, it could have led to a cohort of people who avoided any interaction with the government, with fear about potential consequences, might be in hiding or whatever. And even today, I was quite shocked when COVID hit, that almost universal mistrust of official Indonesian government figures and data from both Indonesians residing in Australia and in Indonesia. The trust was 0%.
Right. So, I'm really not the person in this room who should be taking a stab at answering that question. I think we have some very eminent demographers who know far more about those data than I do. I'm not going to necessarily call on them, but one of my dreams has been to do a presentation here, because we have colleagues like Terry Hall, who wrote the book with Graham Hugo and Valerie Hall and Gavin Jones, right? Before that 1980s book, it's like it's right up there on my desk. So I don't know what you would say to that.
Well, I think the issue of the quality of the data is that demographers do not trust the data. That's why we have methods of dealing with poor data. And there's a number of things about the use of the 1980 census that are questionable. One is that a lot of the material that you're relying on are from the sample census rather than the full count. And the full count we know was an undercount.
Yes.
I would say that the United States Census has a chronic undercount. The Australian Census also has undercounts, and we use other methods to deal with this. The 1971 census, which was closest to the events, and the 1961 census, which is a base for doing comparison of what changed in the decade, are so flawed that it's very difficult to really rely on them. I am, however, really fascinated by your methodologies and the conclusions you've reached. The 3 million is stunning.
Yeah.
And I think the question of where are the bodies?
Yeah.
It's not just a crime fiction novel. This is social science.
Yeah.
And it would be very good to get some other approaches to answer those questions. The adoption issue is one that's fascinating because in both novels and in some of the nonfiction accounts of all this, many of the children were taken by military officers and military, ordinary military, into their families and adopted and turned into military children. I don't know the numbers. I think the whole issue of fostering and adoption is so easy in Indonesia compared to a more legalistic place. I mean, a lot of people take in a cousin or whatever. There was a paper about the Kangen family in the 1970s talking about how children were taken in, often to become semi-servants. And all of that, I think, could be elaborated by research in Indonesia.
Yes.
In terms of trusting the BPS, the Statistics Indonesia, I have been always very impressed by the efforts that they put into getting things right. I'm also impressed by the work of the rest of the government to make it as difficult as possible for them. It's astounding that the BKKBN, the Department of Home Affairs, I mean, all of the people who could help the BPS get better data are seemingly only interested in their own power. And that's why the 2010 census, 2020 census have been really flawed.
Yeah.
If I could just end up by saying, what I didn't see was the intercensal surveys.
Yes.
Because Indonesia, like Australia, relies on censuses every 5 years. There's a census in the 10 number and the intercensal surveys.
Right.
And we find that in comparing the growth rates from the smaller samples of the intercensal surveys, you are getting anomalies,
Yes.
lots of anomalies.
Yes.
I'm wondering whether you use the intercensal surveys because they are often linked with other surveys that give you a validation process.
These are just so this is why I didn't answer your question. I mean, there are many things I think I should say here. One is, if you look at the report, the adoption report, one of the fears that the relatives who were fostering the kids voiced was we will only let this child go if we get a guarantee that they will not become a household servant. That, I think, speaks to one of the things you said. The reason we didn't use Susenas, SUPAS. The reason we didn't use SUPAS is it doesn't have the spatial disaggregation, the samples that are available to us that we need for a lot of this analysis. Kecamatan, if I remember correctly, is not reported. And a lot of this is, in fact, a Kecamatan level analysis, right? So there were a number of reasons we didn't use it. And one of them, actually, honestly, was the apprehension that SUPAS and census are so different from each other. Which one do we believe, right? And so I think we sort of just put our stock in the census. We said it has a spatial disaggregation. But it goes ultimately, Terry, back to the point that I made earlier, that like you, I have a kind of a suspicion of a lot of these data, especially when it comes to variables that are not head counts. Head counts are easier to do. Yeah. But when you start asking people about their ages and you see these massive heaping problems, I think you have to be a little more suspicious about the signals that you're getting from those variables. So a lot of different things went into trying to do this analysis in a way that was respectful of the data, but also that acknowledged that it is deeply flawed in different ways. And this is why the cross-validation efforts are so important, right? So, when you see, for example, thank you. So when you see, for example, that the city of Kadiri is a hotspot, that gives you cause for optimism because we know that that was the case, right? When you see, for example, that people are showing up apparently in large numbers in areas that the army intelligence was saying people were going to, right? That gives you cause. So there's been a lot of, it's qualitative, it's not statistical because this kind of thing cannot be, right? But we are constantly looking to the qualitative literature to say, does this make sense? Right?
It's a fascinating insight, but it still won't show you it is not there.
Sorry?
It's there, but it still won't show you it is not in census. And the people most likely to not get a census, otherwise would appear as a government.
Oh, absolutely.
Just a passing thought on the adoption issue, you might look at what the Argentine junta did during a similar operation there. There they actually had a political strategy of adopting the children of the people they killed in order to save those children and turn them into
good citizens.
Good citizens. Yeah. And they got adopted into the military family.
No question from Matt.
Can I thank you, Terry, for that response?
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. Your estimate response on this so much larger than expected number of casualties. Going to your point that there is a lot about the kids down there now. Even the Holocaust, one of the most well researched case of genocide in the 20th century. Even there is, according to experts, more than one than what we know. Greg's point, I think we would expect telltale signs in the qualitative literature that there are so many bodies. One thing we would expect could be outbreaks of diseases, for example. Where bodies were buried. And there is one such telltale sign from Clarkson that was called Gestorf disease. People actually can see from what it was. But might have been either dysenteria, typhoid. But and there was local people agriculted to living in the proximity of those mass graves to the point that the water made you sick.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Thanks.
Let's go to a question online and then we'll come back to the.
We have one question online from Kalana Wisnu. The question is there any evidence of correlation between economic indicators, particularly GDP growth trajectories and the nationalization of foreign enterprises in the early 1960s and the demographic patterns of the 1965 to 1966 mass killings? I raise this as someone born and raised in Blitar and from a family of survivors.
I haven't studied that. I do research in 4 areas. I am an economist by training, but only one of them is economic, and it's on drug trafficking. So I can't answer that question. I think it's the economic basis for some of what was happening in 1965 is undeniable, right? Because economics is closely intertwined with politics, and politics was obviously closely intertwined with what happened here. So I guess the best I can say is maybe that's some research that you should do, or if there's somebody in the room who has an answer to the question. There are a lot of unanswered questions, right? And this is the history of the 4th largest country in the world, a very important player in the globe. The more we study it and the more we answer these questions, the better.
Yes, thank you. This may be a very naive question, so I apologize. The population deficit that you talk about of, say, 3 million, that presumably includes not just those who were killed, but the potential children born to those who were killed.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you're looking at maybe dividing that 3 million by 3 or something like that to get closer to your figure of the number killed.
Absolutely. It's a population deficit, and that's one of the reasons. So here's the thing, right? It's a little mysterious because the fertility rate, at least if you look at what demographers who were doing arguably back of the envelope calculations in some cases were saying, the fertility rate did not take a hit at the time for whatever mysterious reason, right? But if it did take a hit, and a noticeable one, maybe that can explain part of it. So you're absolutely right? I mean, we have to look, when we look at aggregate population changes, at 3 components of that aggregate, right? Deaths, of course, but births and net migration too. And if we can't rule them out, then they are part of the story.
See, that means you are estimating the population deficit.
Yes.
Not the actual killing.
No.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, even the trajectory method, right? That drop, it has been wrongly interpreted by a lot of scholars as representing deaths in the context of my work on the flu pandemic. It's not deaths.
Yeah.
It is deaths plus net migration.
Yeah.
Plus a deficit in births.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So the estimates we've done for the flu pandemic, there's so many papers that have cited and said, this is the number of deaths. Well, it could be the number of deaths that there were no migration and birth effects.
Yeah.
But that's an upper limit. That's an upper bound to the estimate of deaths. The number of times that work has been cited without recognition of that is, maybe I made a mistake and I didn't
But
communicate
that clarification is very important.
it. It is. It's not a trivial question.
Yeah.
I will say that from my study of the flu pandemic, the births tend to be a fraction of the deaths and their contribution to those deaths. They tend to be a fraction. Probably in the range of 10, 15%, maybe 20%, which is another reason why I just said 2 million seems like a conservative, safe number to go if you're seeing a deficit of 3. But it shouldn't be 500,000 is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, Siddharth and Salis. So one suggestion is that, so what you present is you kind of argue on a certain number of policing deficit, and then you show other evidence that link based on logical, because of this, you have this orphan, you have this widows and so on. However, it would be nice if this link is not only biological, but also by numbers. So for example, on the correlation between number of adoption, you're not correlated to PKI stronghold, but other than with number of where the people actually deficit. So then we could actually show the link is actually based on numbers. So
absolutely,
every 2 people lose how many children is actually adopted.
Totally.
So, and how many widows is actually incidentally. So that correlation is quite strong. Then you could kind of more logical understanding. Now, despite I said that the adoption for a Japanese, I'm still puzzled on what is this number. So, as Terry has mentioned, in Japanese culture, adoption of your family into your family, the other family into your family is common. So Martos, for example, has been adopted by his uncle and so on. I myself, for a certain period of time, I was living with my uncle. But when this adoption happened, very seldom that the one that adopt me will say that I'm other relative. No, they will say that if there's somebody asks, they will say that this is my son. And even up until now, even up until we grow up, I was always saying that I have two father and two mother. And even some of my cousins already thought that your original mother and father say this, but still arguing that, always claiming that in the paper and so on, the other one, the one that they grew up. So what is exactly this other relative, if it is among Japanese, who actually claim saying that when they was interviewed, and that is other relative. So exactly
what does it mean?
And if it is most of the adopted of people are by their family, not that sure they will say that during the census this is other relative.
That's right.
So exactly what happened over there is still puzzling to me.
So Budi, both of these are fantastic comments. I'll respond to the first one first. One of the challenges that I've faced in doing all of this work is I'm a quantitative researcher like you, right? And we were taught to do statistics and, technically, involved stuff, right? But if I do my research to appeal to that audience, the emphasis is very often on technique. It's not on what happened, right? So the problem that I've been facing in this project is what language do I want to speak? And with whom is this conversation happening? And I've come to the conclusion that the conversation needs to happen with the people who are interested in what happened, right? So the focus of the research, and there is way more to get out of the censuses than I'll be able to do in my lifetime. So, you have to make hard decisions here. I would love to get to actually create estimates of what fraction of these deficits are attributable to fertility versus mortality. I think they're wonderful things to do. I've just had to choose, what to do first. And I personally think that in terms of what I'd like to contribute is just more of a fundamental understanding of what happened, because that has been missing from Indonesia for a long time. It's bubbling up, it's coming out, but the censuses offer a unique way, a unique perspective. So I completely agree with your comment. I would love to do it. And by the way, this is a cry for help also. If anybody's interested in getting involved, there is enough to be got out of these censuses for many dissertations and many, many papers. The second comment, I think, is also, I think, a really wonderful comment because what my hope is that some of this research will motivate is exactly answering the kinds of questions that you raise, right? So if let's say that I find, so one is, of course, asking people, going into the field and saying, what does this really mean? If I'm in, Blitar, what does it mean that people say I'm in the house with another relative? If I'm in, let's go to Pasuruan, what does it mean, right? I think these are very important questions. So a lot of these results, right, I think raise as many questions, sometimes more than they answer. And I'm hoping that this is something that will spark research that will help answer some of these questions. I'll just give you one other example. If you take a look at some of these maps, right? What is this? These are excess births. So forget it. We don't even know for sure whether this was a misreporting phenomenon of births, right? This September 65 spike, I don't know what was going on in the minds of the people who answered this question in disproportionately large numbers. All we see is there's a spike. We know it is correlated with PKI strongholds. We know that this reporting of I'm living in a household where it's not my birth parent is in the census. Where is it coming from and why? Right? It looks like orphaning. It looks like adoption. Is it really? I mean, all the signs, in my opinion, point to it. But yeah, let's disprove it if we can, you know. So a lot of questions. You know, when you estimate Kacamatan level population loss, the number of Kacamatan for which I see large deficits, which don't appear in any of the qualitative work, is huge, right? There are a lot of untold stories out there. All the data are wrong, right? And I think we always have to be prepared to accept that possibility as well.
Last question from Ava, now we have one.
So much for the wonderful talk. It's very interesting you mentioned the deficit of males. I was just wondering whether we could also see a missing women phenomenon, because that's almost at the same time when Amartya Sen mentioned, okay, we are in some countries, in India, we are seeing this missing women, end 19th century, early and also mid 20th century. Do we also see that one in some perhaps a neighboring region from what you've focused in your research? Because when you mention about the spike, let's say the increase in birth rate, do we also see the female mortality during the birth procedure, for example, and also in terms of prevalence of son over boys over girls, for example?
Yeah. I haven't seen evidence of that in the data I've analyzed, but in all truth, I haven't been looking for it, right? I'm just trying to look for anomalies that happen at that time and ask whether they may in some way be related to what we know was happening at the time, right? Obviously, male preference in terms of culture has been an ongoing issue in Indonesia. We know that males were disproportionately killed in 1965. I mean, just look at the photo. Look at the photographic evidence, right? It's there, and it's also there in the sex ratio, anomalies. But no, I'm sorry. I think it's a very interesting topic. I'll say one other thing. So there is a fantastic literature on the fate of women in 1965, right? Look at the work of Annie Coleman, a number of ANU products, right? A lot of it has come out of here. It's fantastic. And in some sense, I guess what I'm doing is complementing that by saying, with the women, you have survivors telling these horrific stories. The men don't survive. And that we're going to see in the census. Right? The women are still alive during these censuses. The men go away. They disappear. That's the compliment.
On that note, we have to end this talk. Please join me in thanking